Welcome. This is Leadership for Society, Race and Power. I'm Professor Brian Lowery, and today we're talking about race and music with Dr. Bruce Conforth. Bruce was a founding curator of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and is also the author of numerous books and articles. Most recently, Up Jumped the Devil, The Real Life of Robert Johnson. Thanks for being with us, Bruce.
It's a real pleasure, Brian. I'm glad to be here.
Great. That was somehow a tongue twister. I don't know what that was about, but so let's just jump right in. Um, I'm first curious about how you came to focus on race in the music.
That goes back to the early 1960s. I grew up in and around Greenwich Village, and I was part of the folk revival that was going on at the time. And at that time, amazing artists, Black artists like Son House, Mississippi John Hurt, Reverend Gary had been around for a while, but Skip James, Mississippi Fred McDowell, uh, a number of other artists were being quote unquote rediscovered. Um, they had been inactive for decades. Um, and they were being found by young white college students who were 78 aficionados and had gone hunting for them and found many of them and would bring them up to New York City, to Greenwich Village. And so very early on, I got attuned to Black music unlike anything I had ever heard, because you have to think about it. In the early 1960s, Black music meant soul music. Um, it meant rhythm and blues. It even meant people like Louis Jordan, people like that. And then all of a sudden, here come these people um, singing this song that sounds like this music that sounds like it could have come from Mars. Um, very, very primal, very raw, um, uh, playing guitars in ways that we had never heard before, singing about topics that were not how much is your doggy in the window, but I got death letter blues. I got a letter this morning. My baby was dead. Um, really, really, it was like a major revelation, an
Hmm.
incredibly major revelation. And so uh, I felt an incredible kinship with the music, and immediately launched myself into that world as much as I could. One of the first things I did was to start to take lessons with Reverend Gary Davis, perhaps one of the greatest guitarists, one of the greatest untaught guitarists of the 20th century. Um, and when you took a lesson with Reverend Gary Davis, you'll see where I'm going with this. You didn't just learn the music, you listened to his stories, you ate his food that his wife Annie cooked. Um, you heard the gospel tunes. You were totally immersed in the culture. And so, as a young person, I got this real heavy introduction to Black culture along with Black music.
I love that story. I got a similar introduction, but I would just call that home life. But it wasn't music, but it certainly was food and stories for sure. The other thing about that story that strikes me is when I think about music, I think about it as for me as a personal soundtrack, right? I think music is just a part of life. It's just there all the time, at least for me. And I also think about it as a kind of a soundtrack for social life. Um, it serves to me as like an emotional backdrop to what's going on, and I think many people have that experience. It brings back epics, the way you talked about that time in the United States and what it meant to hear that music for you. Um, because music is like this, I think it really can help make sense of or teach us something about history, right? So I'm curious, as you think about music history, this is something obviously you think about quite a bit. Um, what does it tell us about the story of race in the United States from your perspective?
I think the story of America is inseparable from music. I don't think you can talk about American culture at all without talking about music. Um, you know, Africans were brought here starting in what 1639, something like that, and from that time on, uh, their influence just grew and grew and grew and grew, and we can see it in all kinds of musics, um, minstrelsy, slave songs, work songs. Um, the whole idea of a work song was new to American culture. I don't know of any particular record of work songs among Anglos before African Americans um, brought their work song to the fore. So we have also the idea that in 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 Black culture, as opposed to white culture is compartmentalized. You know, it always there's a time to do this, there's a time to do that, there's a place to do this, there's a place to do that, and I think from my experience that there's a much more integrated relationship with things in Black culture. You sing when you work, you sing when you cook, you sing when you play. You know you there there's a relationship between music and life that is holistic. It's not compartmentalized. It's holistic. It's very healthy. It's very nourishing, and it served as a sense of survival. So for hundreds of years, literally, um, the story of American music is intrinsically tied with American history.
Yeah, my experience of it, and you're the historian, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but almost all indigenous American music. By that, I mean obviously there's indigenous music prior to the arrival of colonial America, so that I want to obviously acknowledge that. But when we think of America as the United States, um, the music that's been produced in the country as we know it now. So I would put in there blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, things that have been were created here. All those things have been influenced by descendants of slaves. But there's
Even
this
country, even
mhm,
country.
country western, yeah. But it's interesting to me, given the influence of African Americans, descendants of slaves, on music, that there's still a desire to kind of separate that influence out. And this is why I think it's important that you say country and Western. There's still this sense of there's white music and there's Black music. How is that still around? Like, what do you think about that division?
Ownership is a big thing. Um, and people want to lay claim to their piece of the pie. Um, you know, African American music is really a remarkable phenomenon in the sense that when you think about it coming from a people who were denied mainstream access to politics, to society, to economics, to cultural forays. I mean, people who were denied basically mainstream access to anything create this music that then becomes reverse hegemonic. It becomes the most important cultural artifact in American culture because, as you said, it influences everything. And I think white culture recognized that and said, wait a minute, time out. We have to put our mark on this. We have to make sure that we have a claim to something somewhere in here. Um, with country music, for instance, D. Ford Bailey on the Grand Ole Opry. The first Black to perform on the Grand Ole Opry. Um, but yet his role was minimized, and he was only allowed to do certain things. Um, Record producers during the race era, white record producers, only allowed black performers to record certain things. They could only record the blues. We could say that again. This is part of the the compartmentalized trope of white culture, but I think it goes deeper than that. It goes to a preteristic nostalgia for wanting to believe that there was some kind of purity at some point that somehow got perverted, and we can somehow fix that by laying claim to certain portions of it.
Mhm. And that makes sense to me. Also, one of the things that you said that struck out to me is this the idea of or maybe this is one of the way I translated in my mind, the idea of boundary maintenance, right? So we have to compartmentalize this thing and then lay claim to a part of it, but separate it out. And so I also wonder if music has this unfortunate pernicious effect of making boundaries seem more stark than they are, that people use music to create boundaries. So like growing up, for example, I listened to a lot of soul music early on because that's what my family listened to. And at the time, right? So it's the mid 70s, a lot of funk. So the first album I remember is George Clinton, right? So that's the first thing I remember dancing to when I was a kid, and in the house, my parents were playing that. And so I grew up in Chicago, which has a very strong, like a lot of most cities, a strong musical history, listening to um, again, like R&B, hip hop, early hip hop, house music, which is now like, I guess, a version. EDM is now what house music was when I was growing up. But I did not listen to. There was a bunch of music I didn't listen to, right? And so when I went to some place like college and people play a song at a party and I was like, hey, everybody's yay, and they all recognize it, and I don't know what it is. And similarly, if I were to play a song that it seems incredibly popular to me, a number of people who I might be with wouldn't have any idea of what that song is. So I wonder if music and being so attached to it early on, and having such emotional resonance has this effect of dividing us a bit. What do you think about that?
Hmm. Well, I think we have a tendency in our culture in general to overlook the symbiotic relationship between all portions of this American experiment. Um, we, there's what has been called, the essential framework of musical culture, and that is that somehow uh, African Americans draw upon their African roots to create something unique, since they are denied mainstream access to society. And so they create something completely unique. Um, Whites come along and they pick up on it and they water it down for white consumption. Um, and it becomes greatly successful for them. They make a lot of money off of it. And then the blacks who created it in the first place say, okay, that's enough. Now we're moving on to something else because that no longer has any relevance for us. Um, and that I think is a story that we want to believe somehow. There's I think it's one of the great myths of American culture. Not that there's not some truth to it, but I think it really is kind of mythical in a sense and overlooks the fact that there has always been this symbiosis between black and white culture. And with that, you know, John Leland, I don't know if you know his work. He wrote a great book called Hip the History. And in it he talks about this relationship that you can't really say that hip exists only because of one culture or the other. Look, I'll put it this way: blues would not exist without white people. It's that simple. White people were responsible for slavery and racism, and it was because of Jim Crow racism and slavery that African Americans uh, were able to create, you know, the the formations of the music that would eventually become the blues. Um, Blues is often hailed as uniquely African American, uniquely African, but in a very absurd way. If it hadn't been for racism, there wouldn't have been the blues. If it hadn't been for whites, there wouldn't have been the blues.
Right, that's man, that's a hard story to tell. I hear you. I hear you. Created the conditions of oppression, created the possibility of this music genre. I get that. And I mean, you could say that for I guess a lot of cultural production, right? I see that. But wow, I thought where you would go with it is more like that it's that cultural creation, in particular music, but also we're going to talk, by the way, about food in the next episode. The next time we talk, is the sort of thing that is produced by passing from hand to hand, right? That everyone has that contributes, everyone that touches it, that sings it, that hears it, has some contribution. And I think I could see that in music too. I mean, I would. I would just say it feels uncomfortable to think about the contribution that white people have made to American music is oppression. That's a
It's a heavy thing. Yeah, it's a heavy thing, and obviously that's not the only. I was being hyperbolic, in that explanation. It's clearly not the only contribution that whites have made. But you could go there and you could say that there is a causality between white oppression and the creation of the blues. I mean, come on,
yeah, yeah.
you
Oh,
know,
there's no doubt, no doubt.
unquestionably,
Yeah.
unquestionably. But by the same token, you can say that country music wouldn't exist without African Americans.
Mhm.
And
But
I'll
not
give you
because African Americans oppressed white people, though.
no, 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 no. It's not. No, not at all. And not all whites oppressed African Americans.
Mhm.
You know, um, but Arnold Schultz, African American, taught Bill Monroe. I mean, think about it. What white music, if you were to say what the quintessential form of white American music is, you'd probably say bluegrass. You know, here's this great white American music, bluegrass. Um, it typifies everything about whiteness in the American South. And yet Arnold Schultz, like I was going to say, an African American, taught Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass music, how to play guitar and how to play mandolin.
Mhm.
Um, Doc Boggs, who is credited with creating the bluegrass style of banjo playing, um, was actually trying to imitate on the banjo the guitar playing of Mississippi John Hurt, black musician. The banjo itself comes from Africa. It's
Mhm.
not an American instrument. So, I mean, this is the kind of symbiotic relationship that I'm talking about. We can't the boundaries to put up boundaries in culture are so incredibly artificial and so incredibly problematic. What they do is they beg you to compartmentalize. and
Mhm.
and that and culture is not about compartmentalization. Culture is a steady stream, ebb and flow, give and take. That's what it is.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Right, that is cultural formation is um, both multifaceted and contributed by everyone that participates in that culture. Um, but I think that this simplification, the story, the fantasy that people want to tell themselves, um, can be frustrating. I'll give you an example of why, right? So again, I grew up in my formative years, like hip hop was not really mainstream, right? So there was, I remember the first time MTV played a hip hop uh, um, video, right? I remember it not people talking about always putting labels on music. Most of that was hip hop, right? Putting parental guidance on music, and it wasn't seen as let's call it respectable. So there's something about those boundaries that allow us to, in dismissing the music as serious, dismiss certain people as serious. So I think about that. And what that leads me to, and going back to kind of the idea of um, cultural creation, possibly cultural appropriation, is this an idea of respectability in music? So when I gave you that idea of hip hop, it was cool for white kids to like hip hop when I was coming up because it was not normative. People didn't do it. And so I wonder what you think about that. And I know that I'm sure you're aware of it, but back in the day, Norman Mailer wrote a essay
The
about
white Negro.
hypnosis. Yes, the white Negro about hypnosis. Not well known now. It was Baldwin more or less hated it, but Eldridge Cleaver was kind of a fan of it. It was just my understanding of it at the time was a very, very divisive piece. But I get it in theory. Like I get the basic idea that there's something about wanting to be associated with something that feels countercultural, but not having to deeply engage with that experience. What do you make of that?
Oh yeah, Jack Kerouac in On the Road, you know, laments how much he wishes he was a Negro because the Negro knows how to live. The Negro knows how to survive. The Negro knows all these great secrets. And yeah, I mean, he waxes for pages about how much he wishes he was a Negro because the Negro lives on the edge. And I think that yeah, it's very, very true. From minstrelsy on, I have a suspicion that to a large extent, well, I don't know about a large extent, but to some extent, minstrelsy was a way for at least some whites to admire Black music in a way in which they didn't have to admit that they were actually Negro lovers. That they could appreciate the music without without kind of like from a safe distance. And as popular music began to progress, that distance began to get closer and closer and closer with rock and roll and with jazz and with rap now particularly. I still think that there's a great deal of exotic other involved in this. Um, I cannot help but believe that a great deal of the fascination among whites with rap music is precisely that it's slightly dangerous. It's living. I get to live on the edge a little bit. I get to be a, a dark, strange person for just a little bit of time, and then I can go back to my suburb and take sleep in my mommy and daddy's house. But for the time that I was at that rap concert or whatever, I was living dangerously.
Well, what's interesting about that is I can imagine that, and certainly that's been an argument made for minstrelsy, and there's still like not that long ago, there's been people called out about wearing blackface, and some of their arguments were it was really because I love this musician, right? So trying to connect. But given all that, one thing I find strange is how, and this is also historically true, how well white musicians who play black music do in that genre, right? So you have, again, going back, you have um, people who were actually good. Like the Beastie Boys were great, but they, I mean, the amount of attention they got was, I would say, disproportionate at the time to their um, what they were producing compared to other people in that space. You have, and you can just go. I mean, I can just even in hip hop, it's easy to talk about Vanilla Ice. So people now, probably the younger people, probably don't know who that is. Or even in 2014 when Macklemore won the Grammy, and it was like pretty much seen as something that was stolen from Kendrick Lamar. But the point is, whether you agree with those things or not, it's interesting if it's about connecting with these people. Why are these artists who are performing, these white artists that are performing it, so accepted in the community? Why do they do so well?
Well, for the same reason that Elvis did.
And
Because
what is
Sam,
that?
just like, because Sam Phillips always said, if I could find a white boy who could sing like a black boy, I'd make myself a fortune.
What is it? A gateway drug? What is going on with that? I don't get it. Right? If you want if you want what you think of as black music, why don't you want it from black people? I mean, I think that's changing. I don't know if it's changing.
It is. It is. I think it is. I think it is changing. But but you know, it's a palatability. It's it's more acceptable. It and there's trappings. You can you can indulge yourself in the trappings without having to worry about being black in America.
And here's what really, I won't say it just straightforward, like really bothers me about that is it also means that you actually don't, if that's what's going on, it's hard to say you really appreciate the music because you're not engaging with where the music comes from, right? It's, I don't, there's this idea of people embracing the culture, but not the people who are involved in producing that culture. Um, and this is again going back to a worry, which is if music is allowing people to fool themselves into thinking they're engaging with something that they're not truly engaging with in a deep way, is that seems like a bad thing to me. And it's hard for me to think of appreciating music as a bad thing.
Well, um, to answer that, I'm going to go back 160 years, 108, 70 years, 80. I'm not good at math. But in 1848, Frederick Douglass um, came out and said that he was vehemently opposed to minstrelsy. He said it was the scum music of the earth and only appeased white minds. A year later, in 1849, after having seen a black minstrel performance, he changed his mind and he said, "Oh, you know what? Um, yeah, this may not be the greatest thing in the world, but by the same token, anything that gets our culture out in the mainstream is probably a pretty good thing. It's probably a pretty good thing." And so, you know, there is that element that, as long as it's out there, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But getting back to your point, you know, I had a student who was absolutely vehement that Eminem was black, because Eminem grew up in a black neighborhood, and Eminem, you know, I guess immersed himself in black culture, um, and Eminem, you know, mastered his form of rapping. And this student was a white student, was absolute. I could not dissuade this person that Eminem was not black. I used to say to him, I used to say things like, you know, Eminem and a black man walk into a bank. Who gets treated better? I used to bring up all kinds of examples like that, and it just never made any difference. And I think you're absolutely right that the appreciation for the music is not enough without understanding. I mean, it's like not barely the tip of an iceberg. I mean, you cannot understand any music if you just listen to the music. You can appreciate the music, but you can't really understand the music. You don't know where it came from. You don't know why it was produced. You don't know for whom it was produced. You don't know under what circumstances it was produced. Um, I know that my students who were very much into hip hop um, didn't have a clue who the Black Poets were. Um, they didn't have a clue who uh, some of the early DJs were. They didn't have a clue as to the social construct of why rap came out of the South Bronx. They didn't have a clue as to any of the context. All they knew is that, yeah, they're talking about something that I think is really down. It's really dank. I mean, you know, they pick up on the surface nuance, but really don't appreciate, and they can't. They can't because they haven't been turned on to it,
Hmm.
which leads to the major issues of cultural appropriation as opposed to cultural appreciation.
Hmm. No, I get that. And going back to expanding on the appropriation, I'd love to hear what you have to say about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because as you know, well, we pointed out that you were a founding curator, but it has not had the best record of dealing with um, Black artists. It's
The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame originally was a vanity project for Ahmet Ertegun, who was the head of Atlantic Records, and Jan Wenner, who was the head of Rolling Stone magazine. That's it. I mean, that's the genesis of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was basically a vanity project for those two individuals. And a lot has been said. Um, I've heard. I know Jan, and I knew Ahmet. Um, and Ahmet often gets great cred for what he did to bring black music into the popular arena. But you got to remember, that he paid Ruth Brown $75 to sing a song she didn't want to sing, "Mama, He Treats Your Daughter Mean," because she thought that was not reflective of her experiences in the black community. She got $75 and no royalties for it. Uh, so that, yeah, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the whole popular music industry obviously has been an extraordinarily exploitative one.
Mhm. And so, just we have just a little time left. I'd like to think about where we are right now in terms of the. Some people call it a racial reckoning. We'll see if it's a reckoning, but it certainly is an outpouring of a mixture of rage and demands and concern about the state of race in this country. And as I think about music, I also think it has a really important role to play in terms of helping create protest. And there's from my vantage point, I'm right now most um, the music that I most like in this space, not surprising given my love of rap, is Run the Jewels. So they do a lot of work that touches on what's going on right now in the world. What role do you see music playing in the moment today, in today's moment of racial reckoning, if in fact that's what it is? And what would you suggest people listen to if they wanted to have a deeper understanding of the moment?
I have a rather different perspective on the relationship between music and other things, and like contemporary movements and things. Um, I think music can serve as a rallying point, Um, but I think to a large extent, music is kind of like the soundtrack to what's going on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a mobilizing force either. Um, you know, Lawrence Levine, the scholar Lawrence Levine, once said that uh, you can't, just because um, culture doesn't call for outright resistance or overt anti-capitalist sentiment or um, strident revolution, does not mean that it's not political.
Mhm.
That there's lots of ways for culture and music to be political, and I think that we're seeing those. I mean, some are more forward than others, but we have to remember that, the idea of signifying in Black culture, in saying things in ways that are meant for your culture and not necessarily meant for somebody else. And I think that a lot of what's going on contemporaneously has to do with reaffirming the ideas of selfhood, reaffirming the ideas of man and womanhood, reaffirming the ideas of status in society, reaffirming the ideas of power in society, creating a new sense of agency. Um, because that's what I think. I think agency is what Black music has always been about. Right? It's always been about issues of survival and resistance and personal agency. And you take, I'm going to go back a couple of years, not too different, not too far back, but take something like Beyonce's Formation. Wow, if that wasn't about agency, I don't know what it was. Um, and so I think we should look at what's happening musically today from that perspective, from the perspective of what is it doing to produce and forward the idea of agency within the community.
Mhm. I think that's right. And I think it's important too to keep in mind that agency, for me anyway, that it's not always resistance, that sometimes agency is just the ability to feel joy, right? That's one thing I'll just go,
Absolutely.
right, go back and like I don't that people who aren't familiar with house music or didn't have that experience. Like I just remember that music as being such a different, the feeling was so, it was just so different. It was so joyous. And hip hop, it just has a more of a I do think of that as more about self-assertion, right?
Yeah,
And even that has changed, right? Because there was a time when hip hop was, a lot of that was almost purely party music too, right? That evolved into something like all genres do evolve into something a little bit different. But um, I think when we think about this moment for me, it's both, it's about agency, but recognizing that agency is an agency to push back against what's wrong and an agency to celebrate what's beautiful about your culture.
absolutely. Agency is always that's agency has never been mutually exclusive of those things. I mean, in the blues, hokum blues, it was always the party blues, big thing, you know. But but as well as celebrating the joy of being where you were, it also served in that joyful way as a way of reaffirming the sense of self.
Mhm.
I mean, what better reaffirmation of self is there than the spirit of joy?
And that part I would wholeheartedly agree with it, that it's an affirmation of self, right? That we're here, we're living this life, and there's something to be, maybe it's screamed about, maybe it's celebrated, but we're living life, right? That to me is, I agree that that's a large part of what music is about. Well, I'm gonna stop it there and say thank you so much for spending the time to talk to us. I loved hearing your perspective on these issues. Um, and I'll just say any last thing that you want to say before we leave.
Keep listening.
Thank you for that. All right. If you enjoyed this session, please send your friends and family to our podcast. And thank you for joining us this evening.